You ever think about how much time and energy we put into trying to figure out what students are actually learning? Like, we try to boil it all down to a single letter grade or a test score.
Right. But does that really tell the whole story?
I don't think so. It feels like we're only seeing a tiny part of what's going on in a student's mind. So, how do we get a clearer picture of that deeper growth? That's what we're going to dive into today. We're looking at MindLog for educators.
Interesting.
It's being described as this sophisticated, almost journal-like learning tool. And it's designed to do a couple of things: support students as their minds develop and give educators a visual record of that growth over time.
Okay, I'm listening. What makes this MindLog thing different from other tools out there?
Well, it's not based on some passing educational trend. What really struck me is that this approach is rooted in like over 100 years of solid research into how people learn and grow. So it's got a strong foundation.
So for our listeners, are we going to try to unpack what MindLog is, how it works, and the potential impact it can have?
Exactly. We're going to dig into all of that using a few sources. We've got excerpts from MindLog for educators, some real examples from MindLog notes, and even a fascinating audio piece called On Butterflies to add to the mix.
Okay, that sounds pretty comprehensive.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Now, one of the first things that jumped out at me is that MindLog seems to be doing a few things at once. They call it a form of assessment, but it's also meant to be a learning tool.
Yeah, and not just any assessment. They claim it has high utility, reliability, and even predictive validity. That's a pretty bold claim.
It is, but it's also supposed to be amazing at catching cheating. But the part that I find most interesting is how it supports all these different skills, from self-awareness and how you manage yourself to things like writing, thinking critically, and even how students interact with each other.
It's interesting that they highlight that all these benefits can happen even with minimal involvement from the educator.
Right, like the process itself is supposed to be driving a lot of that learning.
Yeah, the idea is that the structure of reflecting and responding within MindLog is inherently valuable for development. And when we talk about it as assessment, it's not about slapping a grade on something. It's about tracking actual, genuine changes in someone's mental capabilities over time. That's where the reliability and validity come in.
Makes sense. And I guess the cheating detection is just kind of a natural outcome of how the system works.
Exactly. We'll get into that later.
Okay, so one term they keep using is this myeutic method, something they got from Lectica. It's described as post-Socratic, so it's clearly connected to how Socrates used questioning to guide people to truth.
Oh, right. I remember that from philosophy class. So how is Lectica's take on this different, and how does it fit into the whole MindLog approach?
Well, it seems like the difference is in what they're aiming for. Socrates was all about leading you to these specific truths. But with Lectica's myeutic method in MindLog, the focus is more on skill building.
So it's not about arriving at a single right answer, but more about developing those mental muscles that let you think more effectively and at a deeper level.
Exactly. And it changes the whole game for educators. Instead of being the person who pours information into students' heads, you become more of a guide.
So how does MindLog actually work on a day-to-day, or I guess week-to-week basis for students?
So the core of it is these weekly reflections that students do. But it's not just journaling, like whatever comes to mind. It's very structured. Students respond to specific prompts.
And who creates those prompts?
They're created by educators, often with some guidance from Lectica. The goal of the prompts is to make students really think about what they're learning, not just in isolation, but how it connects to their own experiences in the bigger picture.
I see. It's like instead of just memorizing facts, you have to make sense of them in the context of your own understanding of the world.
That's the idea. And they say even just that simple act of reflection can start to have some pretty significant developmental benefits right away.
How is that possible? Does just reflecting on a prompt having an immediate impact?
It's like when you try to explain something you've learned in your own words. That effort to articulate your thoughts actually helps solidify the learning and forces you to engage with the material on a deeper level.
Yeah, you have to wrestle with it a bit.
Exactly. And they say that the more skilled educators become at crafting these prompts and adding what they call micro-suggestions.
Macro suggestions.
Yeah, little nudges, basically, these tiny follow-up prompts that guide students' thinking. That's where the developmental benefits really start to multiply.
So let's walk through how a student actually uses MindLog. Let's say a student gets a prompt. What do they do next?
It's pretty straightforward. They log into the Lectica platform, they choose their educator in class, and then they have a choice. They can either type their reflections into a form or they can speak them.
Wait, speak them.
Yep. They can dictate their response. And this is really cool. If English isn't their first language, they can even submit their reflections in their native language, assuming it's a relatively common one.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
It makes it accessible to so many more students. That's a huge barrier removed.
totally. Now, once a student submits their reflection, where does it go? Does the educator immediately see it?
The educator has access to all the student responses, and they can give feedback on each one, but the student doesn't see that feedback until the educator chooses to release it.
Oh, so it's not like a live chat back and forth.
Right, it's more like a considered response, so the educator can really take the time to think about their feedback, which is great.
Yeah, it creates more of a thoughtful dialogue around the learning. But what if the educator can't give individual feedback every single time? Like, what happens then?
Well, even without that direct feedback from the teacher, there are still ways for students to deepen their learning through MindLog. They could discuss their reflections with classmates, have peer-to-peer feedback sessions, or even talk it through with a parent or guardian.
So, that act of articulating your thoughts out loud, of having to explain your reasoning to someone else, is valuable in itself.
Exactly. It forces you to clarify your thinking and consider different perspectives. Now, you mentioned earlier that MindLog provides this visual record of a student's development. What does that look like for the student?
So, after about 6 months of doing these regular weekly reflections, students start to see a growth chart. It appears whenever they look at a specific entries report.
So they get to see their progress over time. That must be motivating.
It is, but here's the really interesting part. There are no scores visible on these student growth charts. It's a deliberate choice. They don't want to create competition. They want students to focus on their own unique learning journey.
That's really cool. I love that they prioritize individual growth over comparison.
Me too. They actually provide an example in the materials. One prompt is, from your perspective, what is a good education? Then they show a sample student response, and it's amazing to see how the student is thinking about the question. And then you see the educator's comment gently guiding them to consider other viewpoints. And then, get this, the student sets a micro task based on that feedback.
Wow, that's really neat. It really shows how the reflection, feedback, and that little action step all work together.
And while students only see their individual growth, educators actually get a much broader view, right?
Oh, absolutely. They have this really powerful dashboard where they can see the growth charts, not just for individual students, but for entire classes, or even for all their classes at once. So you can filter by subject, create groups of students, all sorts of things.
So you can really zero in on specific areas of learning or see how students are progressing within a particular project.
Exactly. Now, they also use something called lectical scores, which are derived from this thing called Dr. Kurt Fisher's skill scale.
Okay, and what is that exactly?
It's basically a map of typical developmental progression. It shows how different cognitive skills tend to develop across a person's entire lifespan. But here's the key thing. Educators don't need to become experts in this whole intricate scale to use MindLog effectively.
Right, they talk about developing an embodied understanding. What does that even mean? Like, are we talking about a gut feeling for a student's development?
You know, it's kind of like that. Think of a doctor who, after years of practice, has this intuition about a patient's health just by looking at them, even before all the test results are back. It's the same idea here. With repeated exposure to these reflections and growth patterns, educators develop a more intuitive sense of where their students are developmentally and how they're progressing.
I see, it becomes kind of practical wisdom, something you pick up through experience, even if you can't explain the technicalities of the scale.
Right. It's less about memorizing the scale and more about developing that sensitivity through practice.
Now, one of the most striking things they highlight is how these growth charts can also provide insights into a student's well-being, not just their academics.
Oh, right. They gave that example of Janet and Chen.
Yeah, where Janet was initially ahead, but then her growth slowed down. And they suggested that this dip could be a sign that she's struggling with something outside of school, maybe at home or with friends.
And because it's tracking the quality of thinking over time, any big shifts in those patterns can signal something's up.
Right, it's like an early warning system, offering a chance to intervene before those difficulties show up in other, more serious ways.
Absolutely. Now, while students see their own growth, the way MindLog presents it is very intentional. They actually try to avoid direct comparisons between students.
Right, they mention that even though students might be at different levels, the upward trend of the growth lines they see is often very similar. Why do you think that is?
It seems like the main goal is to keep the focus on each student's individual learning and self-reflection. They want students to think critically about their own progress, what's working for them, what their challenges are, and how their effort is related to their growth. So by taking out that element of direct comparison, it takes away some of that pressure to be better than someone else and encourages introspection.
Yeah, it's like, how am I doing, not how am I doing compared to everyone else?
Exactly. Now, they also pointed out some interesting patterns you often see on these growth charts, like sudden drops or sudden jumps. What usually causes those?
A sudden drop can mean the student kind of blew off the reflection, didn't put in much effort. A sudden jump, though, can sometimes mean they got a little too much help from someone else, or maybe even use AI to generate the response.
So those sudden changes can be red flags.
Well, not always. I mean, everyone has an off day, right?
Hmm.
But if you start seeing that same pattern over and over again, it can be a signal that something's not quite right.
It's good to know. So it seems like with this whole mental growth focus, MindLog is going way beyond just seeing if a student can remember a bunch of facts.
Yeah, they're trying to get at this idea of the quality of a student's thinking. Can they apply what they know in new situations? Can they think critically? Can they see the connections between ideas? Can they solve problems? It's about how skillfully they use what they know, not just how much they can regurgitate.
And they list all these other skills that MindLog tries to cultivate, like self-regulation, being able to reflect on your own understanding, interpreting information, making arguments, collaborating with others, seeing things from different perspectives.
It really does feel like a much more holistic approach to learning.
Absolutely. These are the kinds of skills that are so crucial for navigating the complexities of, well, life in general. Dr. Theo Dawson, the founder of Lectica, saw this need way back in the mid-90s. He really wanted to find a way to measure this kind of deep mental development. And that's what ultimately led to the creation of CLS, the scoring system behind MindLog.
And when they talk about mental development, their definition is surprisingly broad, isn't it? It's not just about like pure intellectual capacity.
That's right. They see it as the growth of the whole person. Their senses, emotions, how they physically interact with the world, even their unconscious processes. They believe that learning happens best when all of those aspects are engaged.
Makes sense. It's not just about thinking, it's about being. Now, because MindLog is trying to measure this internal mental development, there are some pretty important rules about how it needs to be used.
Yeah, some non-negotiables.
Absolutely. One of the biggest ones is that MindLog is designed to measure human mental development, meaning the reflections have to be the student's own work.
No shortcuts, no outsourcing.
Exactly. No AI, no relying on grammar checkers beyond basic spelling, no looking up answers during the reflection, and definitely no getting help from other people. The point is to capture that student's genuine thinking at that moment.
So how do you make sure that's happening?
They also emphasize the importance of close supervision for those very first MindLog entries each year, just to establish a good baseline for each student.
So you can catch any inconsistencies or unusual patterns later on.
Exactly. And they suggest about one reflection per week. I don't know if they specify an exact word count, but they do have guidelines about frequency and length. Probably for practical reasons to make sure the data is consistent and that students are really engaging deeply.
That makes sense. And it's good to know that Lectica provides educators with some guidance for creating effective prompts.
Yeah, they have sample prompts and templates that educators can use as a starting point, which can be really helpful, especially when you're first starting out.
So what about parents? Can they see their child's MindLog data?
Yeah, parents or guardians can access it through their child's account, but they actually recommend holding off on sharing the Lectical scores directly with students until high school.
Probably to keep the focus on learning and growth rather than just a number.
Exactly. They want students, especially younger ones, to focus on the process, not get hung up on a score.
There's also that really interesting requirement about how MindLog can be used for grading.
Right, schools that adopt MindLog have to agree not to use the growth charts or the Lectical scores in their formal grading system.
So you can't base a student's grade on their MindLog performance.
Nope. But educators can still grade the reflections themselves using more traditional methods, looking at how clearly students articulate their thoughts or how well they support their ideas. And apparently, Lectica is even working on providing rubrics to help with that in the future.
That's great. So what about data ownership? Who ultimately controls all this information?
Once a student becomes an adult, they become the full owner of their data. Before that, the rights belong to the parents or guardians. And schools need to have agreements in place with parents to allow them to access the records while the student is enrolled.
It seems like they're very conscious of privacy and data rights. They also have some safeguards in place to protect their own intellectual property.
Yeah, they limit you to viewing or downloading only one report or response at a time. They want to ensure that their work is being used responsibly.
That's understandable. They also have a professional development component for educators, right?
Yeah, they mentioned that at least one educator from each school needs to complete this course called VIP VCL in practice within the first year. It seems like a pretty deep dive into the core principles behind MindLog.
Right, especially around something they call micro V-calling,
Mhm.
these very focused short interactions designed to support development. I imagine completing this VIP training gives educators the tools to really maximize MindLog's benefits for their students.
Now, shifting gears a bit, the MindLog notes offered some really good examples of the kinds of prompts they use. They're all very open-ended, encouraging students to think about making decisions, explaining things in their own words, reflecting on personal experiences, looking at things from different perspectives. It really seems like they're trying to get students to think deeply about the world around them.
Definitely. These prompts aren't about finding a single right answer. They're about exploring ideas, considering different possibilities, and developing that flexible, adaptable thinking that's so important in today's world.
Now, the On Butterflies.m4a audio piece is really fascinating. It talks about this concept of assimilation, how people, especially those who are already experts in their field, tend to interpret new ideas through the lens of what they already know. Like, they'll take a new term and just assume it means the same thing as a similar term they're familiar with.
It's like our brains try to fit new information into our existing mental models.
Exactly. So, knowing that educators might initially see MindLog through their current understanding of education, how do you encourage a real shift in their thinking? That's where the butterfly metaphor comes in.
Right. The idea is to introduce these small, subtle changes, these butterflies, that can have a big impact over time. Instead of trying to force a radical transformation, they focus on making these incremental shifts that gradually reshape how people think about learning.
So, how does MindLog itself embody this butterfly effect?
Well, it's designed in a way that allows teachers to start using it right away within their existing teaching methods. They don't have to completely abandon everything they're currently doing, but through the very act of using it, of engaging with the prompts and the reflections and seeing those growth patterns emerge, they're exposed to these new ways of thinking about learning and development.
So the tool itself becomes a vehicle for change. And it sounds like those weekly reflections and micro suggestions are some of those key butterflies that can lead to big shifts in both student thinking and teacher understanding.
Exactly. They're these tiny interventions that over time can have a cascading effect.
Mhm.
And even if the teacher doesn't fully grasp all the nuances of the system right away, MindLog is designed to have a positive effect from the get-go. Just the simple act of reflection encourages students to move beyond trying to find the right answer and to engage in more complex thinking. And as educators observe these growth curves, they start to develop a deeper, more nuanced understanding of their students' needs and how they learn.
The audio also touched on the mission behind MindLog, this commitment to making it accessible to those who need it most. But they also talked about some of the challenges they've faced in achieving that goal.
It's a common struggle, especially for nonprofits. Their initial plan was to use income from their work with businesses to fund their work in education, kind of a Robin Hood approach. But they ran into some roadblocks.
They mentioned losing some early support from academic institutions.
Yeah, and they talked about the difficulty of navigating the skepticism surrounding standardized testing in education.
It's like people have a knee-jerk reaction against anything that sounds like a test.
Yeah, even if it's trying to do something radically different. Now, this commitment to accessibility is really reflected in the design of MindLog, too.
Absolutely. They were really thoughtful about things like limited access to technology and minimizing energy consumption. They knew that if they wanted to reach a wide audience, they couldn't create a tool that was only usable in like high-tech, well-funded environments.
They also had to come up with organizational models that would allow for free use in certain cases.
Yeah, that led them to explore partnerships with schools funded by donors and other creative solutions.
It's interesting that they also mentioned the potential for governments to be interested in MindLog.
Yeah, what do you think is behind that?
Well, they argued that a tool that can help optimize the mental development of all citizens could ultimately lead to a more capable, engaged, and optimistic population.
Which, let's face it, would be a pretty amazing outcome.
It would, and it could have a huge impact on a country's social and economic well-being.
The audio ended on a pretty powerful note, with a critique of how our current education systems are structured. particularly the overemphasis on rote memorization and standardized testing.
Yeah, their argument is that those kinds of systems are not just ineffective, but potentially harmful. Students get bored, disengaged, and they don't develop the skills they actually need to thrive in a rapidly changing world. All that time spent on cramming facts and figures could be spent on developing critical thinking, creativity, and problem-solving abilities.
It feels like such a missed opportunity.
It really does. And their vision for MindLog is to help address that, to create a system that nurtures those higher-level thinking skills and empowers individuals to reach their full potential.
So, to kind of wrap things up, MindLog for Educators is presenting a really different approach to how we think about learning and assessment. It's not just another tool to measure what kids know, it's a tool that's designed to be woven into the learning process itself, supporting mental growth through reflection, feedback, and these tiny little nudges they call microsuggestions.
It's about going beyond those static measures of knowledge and providing a much more dynamic and holistic understanding of how a student's mind is evolving.
And it does all this while still respecting the current practices in education, but encouraging that deeper, more nuanced understanding of how learning and development actually happen. It's the butterfly effect in action.
It's a beautiful image, isn't it? Small changes leading to big transformations.